compose yourself," said the doctor, supporting her. "Be calm, my dear ma'am, pray." "Oh, let me go, in God's name! My dear child, she is dead! She is dying!" "No," cried the doctor passionately. "As he is good and merciful, she will live to bless us all for years to come." The lady fell upon her knees and tried to fold her hands together, but the energy which had supported her so long fled up to heaven with her first thanksgiving, and she sank into the friendly arms which were extended to receive her. End of chapter 33.
Here we go.
Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Contains some introductory particulars relative to a young gentleman who now arrives upon the scene, and a new adventure which happened to Oliver. It was almost too much happiness to bear. Oliver felt stunned and stupefied by the unexpected intelligence. He could not weep or speak or rest. He had scarcely the power of understanding anything that had passed, until, after a long ramble in the quiet evening air, a burst of tears came to his relief, and he seemed to awaken, all at once, to a full sense of the joyful change that had occurred, and the almost insupportable load of anguish which had been taken from his breast. The night was fast closing in when he returned homeward, laden with flowers which he had culled with peculiar care for the adornment of the sick chamber. As he walked briskly along the road, he heard behind him the noise of some vehicle approaching at a furious pace. Looking round, he saw that it was a post-chaise, driven at great speed, and as the horses were galloping and the road was narrow, he stood leaning against a gate until it should have passed him. As it dashed on, Oliver caught a glimpse of a man in a white nightcap, whose face seemed familiar to him, although his view was so brief that he could not identify the person. In another second or two the nightcap was thrust out of the chaise window, and a stentorian voice bellowed to the driver to stop, which he did as soon as he could pull up his horses. Then the nightcap once again appeared, and the same voice called Oliver by his name. "Here!" cried the voice. "Oliver! What's the news? Miss Rose! Master Oliver!" "Is it you, Giles?" cried Oliver, running up to the chaise door. Giles popped out his nightcap again, preparatory to making some reply, when he was suddenly pulled back by a gentleman who occupied the other corner of the chaise, and who eagerly demanded what was the news. "In a word," cried the gentleman, "better or worse?" "Better, much better," replied Oliver hastily. "Thank heaven!" exclaimed the gentleman. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure," replied Oliver. "The change took place only a few hours ago, and Mr. Losberne says that all danger is at an end." The gentleman said not another word, but opening the chaise door, leaped out, and taking Oliver hurriedly by the arm, led him aside. "You are quite certain? There is no possibility of any mistake on your part, my boy, is there?" demanded the gentleman in a tremulous voice. "Do not deceive me by awakening hopes that are not to be fulfilled." "I would not for the world, sir," replied Oliver. "Indeed, you may believe me. Mr. Losberne's words were that she would live to bless us all for many years to come. I heard him say so." The tears stood in Oliver's eyes as he recalled the scene which was the beginning of so much happiness, and the gentleman turned his face away and remained silent for some minutes. Oliver thought he heard him sob more than once, but he feared to interrupt him by any fresh remark, for he could well guess what his feelings were, and so stood apart, feigning to be occupied with his nosegay. All this time Mr. Giles, with a white nightcap on, had been sitting on the steps of the chaise, supporting an elbow on each knee and wiping his eyes with a blue cotton pocket-handkerchief dotted with white spots. That the honest fellow had not been feigning emotion was abundantly demonstrated by the very red eyes with which he regarded the young gentleman when he turned round and addressed him. "I think you had better go on to my mother's in the chaise, Giles," said he. "I would rather walk slowly on so as to gain some little time before I see her. You can say I am coming." "I beg your pardon, Mr. Harry," said Giles, giving a final polish to his ruffled countenance with a handkerchief. "But if you would leave the post-boy to say that, I should be very much obliged to you. It wouldn't be proper for the maids to see me in this state, sir. I should never have any more authority with them if they did." "Well," rejoined Harry Maylie, smiling, "you can do as you like. Let him go on with the luggage if you wish it, and do you follow with us." Only first exchange that nightcap for some more appropriate covering, or we shall be taken for madmen." Mr. Giles, reminded of his unbecoming costume, snatched off and pocketed his nightcap, and substituted a hat of grave and sober shape, which he took out of the chaise. This done, the post-boy drove off. Giles, Mr. Maylie, and Oliver followed at their leisure. As they walked along, Oliver glanced from time to time with much interest and curiosity at the newcomer. He seemed about 25 years of age, and was of the middle height. His countenance was frank and handsome, and his demeanour easy and prepossessing. Notwithstanding the difference between youth and age, he bore so strong a likeness to the old lady that Oliver would have had no great difficulty in imagining their relationship, if he had not already spoken of her as his mother. Mrs. Maylie was anxiously waiting to receive her son when he reached the cottage. The meeting did not take place without great emotion on both sides. "Mother," whispered the young man, "why did you not write before?" "I did," replied Mrs. Maylie, "but on reflection I determined to keep back the letter until I had heard Mr. Losburne's opinion." "But why?" said the young man. "Why run the chance of that occurring which so nearly happened? If Rose had—I cannot utter that word now—if this illness had terminated differently, how could you ever have forgiven yourself? How could I ever have known happiness again?" "If that had been the case, Harry," said Mrs. Maylie, "I fear your happiness would have been effectually blighted, and that your arrival here a day sooner or a day later would have been of very, very little import." "And who can wonder if it be so, mother?" rejoined the young man. "Or why should I say if? It is, you know it, mother, you must know it." "I know that she deserves the best and purest love the heart of a man can offer," said Mrs. Maylie. "I know that the devotion and affection of her nature require no ordinary return, but one that shall be deep and lasting. If I did not feel this, and know besides that a changed behaviour in one she loved would break her heart, I should not feel my task so difficult of performance, or have to encounter so many struggles in my own bosom, when I take what seems to be the strict line of duty." "This is unkind, mother," said Harry. "Do you suppose that I am a boy ignorant of my own mind, and mistaking the impulses of my own soul?" "I think, my dear son," returned Mrs. Maylie, laying her hand upon his shoulder, "that youth has many generous impulses which do not last, and that among them are some which, being gratified, become only the more fleeting. Above all, I think," said the lady, fixing her eyes on her son's face, "that if an enthusiastic, ardent, and ambitious man marry a wife on whose name there is a stain, which, though it originate in no fault of hers, may be visited by cold and sordid people upon her and upon his children also, and in exact proportion to his success in the world, be cast in his teeth and made the subject of sneers against him, he may, no matter how generous and good his nature, one day repent of the connection he formed in early life, and she may have the pain of knowing that he does so." "Mother," said the young man impatiently, "he would be a selfish brute, unworthy alike of the name of man and of the woman you describe, who acted thus." "You think so now, Harry?" replied his mother. "And ever will," said the young man. "The mental agony I have suffered during the last 2 days wrings from me the avowal to you of a passion which, as you well know, is not one of yesterday, nor one I have lightly formed. On Rose, sweet gentle girl, my heart is set, as firmly as ever heart of man was set on woman. I have no thought, no view, no hope in life beyond her, and if you oppose me in this great stake, you take my peace and happiness in your hands and cast them to the wind. Mother, think better of this and of me, and do not disregard the happiness of which you seem to think so little." "Harry," said Mrs. Maylie, "it is because I think so much of warm and sensitive hearts that I would spare them from being wounded. But we have said enough, and more than enough, on this matter just now." "Let it rest with Rose, then," interposed Harry. "You will not press these overstrained opinions of yours so far as to throw any obstacle in my way?" "I will not," rejoined Mrs. Maylie. "But I would have you consider—" "I have considered," was the impatient reply. "Mother, I have considered years and years. I have considered ever since I have been capable of serious reflection. My feelings remain unchanged, as they ever will, and why should I suffer a pain of delay in giving them vent, which can be productive of no earthly good? No, before I leave this place, Rose shall hear me." "She shall," said Mrs. Maylie. "There is something in your manner which would almost imply that she will hear me coldly, mother," said the young man. "Not coldly," rejoined the old lady. "Far from it." "How then?" urged the young man. "She has formed no other attachment." "No, indeed," replied his mother. "You have, or I mistake, too strong a hold on her affections already. What I would say," resumed the old lady, stopping her son as he was about to speak, "is this. Before you stake your all on this chance, before you suffer yourself to be carried to the highest point of hope, reflect for a few moments, my dear child, on Rose's history, and consider what effect the knowledge of her doubtful birth may have on her decision. Devoted as she is to us, with all the intensity of her noble mind, and with that perfect sacrifice of self which, in all matters, great or trifling, has always been her characteristic." "What do you mean?" "That I leave you to discover," replied Mrs. Maylie. "I must go back to her. God bless you." "I shall see you again to-night?" said the young man eagerly. "By and by," replied the old lady, "when I leave Rose." "Will you tell her I am here?" said Harry. "Of course," replied Mrs. Maylie. "And say how anxious I have been, and how much I have suffered, and how I long to see her. You will not refuse to do this, mother?" "No," said the old lady. "I will tell her all." And pressing her son's hand affectionately, she hastened from the room. Mr. Losberne and Oliver had remained at another end of the apartment while this hurried conversation was proceeding. The former now held out his hand to Harry Maylie, and hearty salutations were exchanged between them. The doctor then communicated, in reply to multifarious questions from his young friend, a precise account of his patient's situation, which was quite as consolatory and full of promise as Oliver's statement had encouraged him to hope, and to the whole of which Mr. Giles, who affected to be busy about the luggage, listened with greedy ears. "Have you shot anything particular lately, Giles?" inquired the doctor when he had concluded. "Nothing particular, sir," replied Mr. Giles, colouring up to the eyes. "Nor catching any thieves, nor identifying any housebreakers?" said the doctor. "Not at all, sir," replied Mr. Giles, with much gravity. "Well," said the doctor, "I am sorry to hear it, because you do that sort of thing admirably. Pray, how is Brittles?" "The boy is very well, sir," said Mr. Giles, recovering his usual tone of patronage, "and sends his respectful duty, sir." "That's well," said the doctor. "Seeing you here reminds me, Mr. Giles, that on the day before that on which I was called away so hurriedly, I executed, at the request of your good mistress, a small commission in your favour. Just step into this corner a moment, will you?" Mr. Giles walked into the corner with much importance, and some wonder, and was honoured with a short whispering conference with the doctor, on the termination of which he made a great many bows and retired with steps of unusual stateliness. The subject matter of this conference was not disclosed in the parlour, but the kitchen was speedily enlightened concerning it, for Mr. Giles walked straight thither, and having called for a mug of ale, announced with an air of majesty, which was highly effective, that it had pleased his mistress, in consideration of his gallant behaviour on the occasion of that attempted robbery, to deposit in the local savings bank the sum of £25, for his sole use and benefit. At this the two women servants lifted up their hands and eyes, and supposed that Mr. Giles would begin to be quite proud now, whereunto Mr. Giles, pulling out his shirt frill, replied, "No, no," and that if they observed that he was at all haughty to his inferiors, he would thank them to tell him so. And then he made a great many other remarks, no less illustrative of his humility, which were received with equal favour and applause, and wherewithal as original and as much to the purpose as the remarks of great men commonly are. Above stairs the remainder of the evening passed cheerfully away, for the doctor was in high spirits, and however fatigued or thoughtful Harry Maylie might have been at first, he was not proof against the worthy gentleman's good humour, which displayed itself in a great variety of sallies and professional recollections, and an abundance of small jokes, which struck Oliver as being the drollest things he had ever heard, and caused him to laugh proportionately, to the evident satisfaction of the doctor, who laughed immoderately at himself, and made Harry laugh almost as heartily by the very force of sympathy. So they were as pleasant a party as, under the circumstances, they could well have been, and it was late before they retired with light and thankful hearts to take that rest which, after the doubt and suspense they had recently undergone, they stood much in need. Oliver rose next morning in better heart, and went about his usual occupations with more hope and pleasure than he had known for many days. The birds were once more hung out to sing in their old places. and the sweetest wild flowers that could be found were once more gathered to gladden Rose with their beauty. The melancholy which had seemed to the sad eyes of the anxious boy to hang for days past over every object, beautiful as all were, was dispelled by magic. The dew seemed to sparkle more brightly on the green leaves, the air to rustle among them with a sweeter music, and the sky itself to look more blue and bright. Such is the influence which the condition of our own thoughts exercise even over the appearance of external objects. Men who look on nature and their fellow men, and cry that all is dark and gloomy, are in the right, but the sombre colours are reflections from their own jaundiced eyes and hearts. The real hues are delicate, and need a clearer vision. It is worthy of remark, and Oliver did not fail to note it at the time, that his morning expeditions were no longer made alone. Harry Maylie, after the very first morning when he met Oliver coming laden home, was seized with such a passion for flowers, and displayed such a taste in their arrangement, as left his young companion far behind. If Oliver were behindhand in these respects, he knew where the best were to be found, and morning after morning they scoured the country together, and brought home the fairest that blossomed. The window of the young lady's chamber was opened now, for she loved to feel the rich summer air stream in, and revive her with its freshness. But there always stood in water, just inside the lattice, one particular little bunch, which was made up with great care every morning. Oliver could not help noticing that the withered flowers were never thrown away, although the little vase was regularly replenished, nor could he help observing that whenever the doctor came into the garden, he invariably cast his eyes up to that particular corner, and nodded his head most expressively, as he set forth on his morning's walk. Pending these observations, the days were flying by, and Rose was rapidly recovering. Nor did Oliver's time hang heavy on his hands, although the young lady had not yet left her chamber, and there were no evening walks, save now and then for a short distance with Mrs. Maylie. He applied himself with redoubled assiduity to the instructions of the white-headed old gentleman, and laboured so hard that his quick progress surprised even himself. It was while he was engaged in this pursuit that he was greatly startled and distressed by a most unexpected occurrence. The little room in which he was accustomed to sit when busy at his books was on the ground floor at the back of the house. It was quite a cottage room, with a lattice window, around which were clusters of jessamine and honeysuckle, that crept over the casement and filled the place with their delicious perfume. It looked into a garden, whence a wicket gate opened into a small paddock. All beyond was fine meadowland and wood. There was no other dwelling near in that direction, and the prospect it commanded was very extensive. One beautiful evening, when the first shades of twilight were beginning to settle upon the earth, Oliver sat at this window, intent upon his books. He had been poring over them for some time, and as the day had been uncommonly sultry and he had exerted himself a great deal, it is no disparagement to the authors, whoever they may have been, to say that gradually and by slow degrees he fell asleep. There is a kind of sleep that steals upon us sometimes, which, while it holds the body prisoner, does not free the mind from a sense of things about it, and enable it to ramble at its pleasure. So far as an overpowering heaviness, a prostration of strength, and an utter inability to control our thoughts or power of motion can be called sleep, this is it. And yet we have a consciousness of all that is going on about us, and if we dream at such a time, words which are really spoken, or sounds which really exist at the moment, accommodate themselves with surprising readiness to our visions, until reality and imagination become so strangely blended that it is afterwards almost a matter of impossibility to separate the two. Nor is this the most striking phenomenon incidental to such a state. It is an undoubted fact that although our senses of touch and sight be for the time dead, yet our sleeping thoughts and the visionary scenes that pass before us will be influenced, and materially influenced, by the mere silent presence of some external object, which may not have been near us when we closed our eyes, and of whose vicinity we have had no waking consciousness. Oliver knew perfectly well that he was in his own little room, that his books were lying on the table before him, that the sweet air was stirring among the creeping plants outside, and yet he was asleep. Suddenly the scene changed. The air became close and confined, and he thought, with a glow of terror, that he was in the Jew's house again. There sat the hideous old man in his accustomed corner, pointing at him and whispering to another man with his face averted, who sat beside him. "Hush, my dear," he thought he heard the Jew say. "It is he, sure enough. Come away." "He?" the other man seemed to answer. "Could I mistake him, think you? If a crowd of ghosts were to put themselves into his exact shape, and he stood amongst them, there is something that would tell me how to point him out. If you buried him 50 feet deep and took me across his grave, I fancy I should know, if there wasn't a mark above it, that he lay buried there." The man seemed to say this with such dreadful hatred that Oliver awoke with the fear and started up. Good heaven, what was that which sent the blood tingling to his heart, and deprived him of his voice and of the power to move? There at the window, close before him, so close that he could have almost touched him before he started back, with his eyes peering into the room and meeting his, there stood the Jew, and beside him, white with rage or fear, or both, were the scowling features of the man who had accosted him in the inn-yard. It was but an instant, a glance, a flash before his eyes, and they were gone. But they had recognized him, and he them, and their look was firmly impressed upon his memory, as if it had been deeply carved in stone and set before him from his birth. He stood transfixed for a moment, then, leaping from the window into the garden, called loudly for help. End of chapter 34. Of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Containing the unsatisfactory result of Oliver's adventure, and a conversation of some importance between Harry Maylie and Rose. When the inmates of the house, attracted by Oliver's cries, hurried to the spot from which they proceeded, they found him pale and agitated, pointing in the direction of the meadows behind the house, and scarcely able to articulate the words, "The Jew! The Jew!" Mr. Giles was at a loss to comprehend what this outcry meant, but Harry Maylie, whose perceptions were something quicker, and who had heard Oliver's story from his mother, understood it at once. "What direction did he take?" he asked, catching up a heavy stick which was standing in a corner. "That," replied Oliver, pointing out the course the man had taken. "I missed them in an instant." "Then they're in the ditch," said Harry. "Follow, and keep as near me as you can." So saying, he sprang over the hedge and darted off with a speed which rendered it a matter of exceeding difficulty for the others to keep near him. Giles followed as well as he could, and Oliver followed too, and in the course of a minute or two Mr. Losberne, who had been out walking and just then returned, tumbled over the hedge after them, and picking himself up with more agility than he could have been supposed to possess, struck into the same course at no contemptible speed, shouting all the while most prodigiously to know what was the matter. On they all went, nor stopped they once to breathe, until the leader, striking off into an angle of the field indicated by Oliver, began to search narrowly the ditch and hedge adjoining, which afforded time for the remainder of the party to come up, and for Oliver to communicate to Mr. Losberne the circumstances that had led to so vigorous a pursuit. The search was all in vain. There were not even the traces of recent footsteps to be seen. They stood now on the summit of a little hill, commanding the open fields in every direction for 3 or 4 miles. There was the village in the hollow on the left, but in order to gain that, after pursuing the track Oliver had pointed out, the men must have made a circuit of open ground, which it was impossible they could have accomplished in so short a time. A thick wood skirted the meadowland in another direction, but they could not have gained that covert for the same reason. "It must have been a dream, Oliver," said Harry Maylie. "Oh, no, indeed, sir," replied Oliver, shuddering at the very recollection of the old wretch's countenance. "I saw him too plainly for that. I saw them both as plainly as I see you now." "Who was the other?" inquired Harry and Mr. Losberne together. "The very same man I told you of, who came so suddenly upon me at the inn," said Oliver. "We had our eyes fixed full upon each other, and I could swear to him." "They took this way?" demanded Harry. "Are you sure?" "As I am that the men were at the window," replied Oliver, pointing down as he spoke to the hedge which divided the cottage garden from the meadow. "The tall man leaped over just there, and the Jew, running a few paces to the right, crept through that gap." The two gentlemen watched Oliver's earnest face as he spoke, and looking from him to each other, seemed to feel satisfied of the accuracy of what he said. Still, in no direction were there any appearances of the trampling of men in hurried flight. The grass was long, but it was trodden down nowhere, save where their own feet had crushed it. The sides and brinks of the ditches were of damp clay, but in no one place could they discern the print of men's shoes, or the slightest mark which would indicate that any feet had pressed the ground for hours before. "This is strange," said Harry. "Strange," echoed the doctor. "Blathers and Duff themselves could make nothing of it." Notwithstanding the evidently useless nature of their search, they did not desist until the coming on of night rendered its further prosecution hopeless, and even then they gave it up with reluctance. Giles was dispatched to the different alehouses in the village, furnished with the best description Oliver could give of the appearance and dress of the strangers. Of these the Jew was, at all events, sufficiently remarkable to be remembered, supposing he had been seen drinking or loitering about. But Giles returned without any intelligence calculated to dispel or lessen the mystery. On the next day fresh search was made, and the inquiries renewed, but with no better success. On the day following, Oliver and Mr. Maylie repaired to the market town, in the hope of seeing or hearing something of the men there, but this effort was equally fruitless. After a few days the affair began to be forgotten, as most affairs are, when wonder, having no fresh food to support it, dies away of itself. Meanwhile Rose was rapidly recovering. She had left her room, was able to go out, and mixing once more with the family, carried joy into the hearts of all. But although this happy change had a visible effect on the circle, and although cheerful voices and merry laughter were once more heard in the cottage, there was at times an unwonted restraint upon some there, even upon Rose herself, which Oliver could not fail to remark. Mrs. Maylie and her son were often closeted together for a long time, and more than once Rose appeared with traces of tears upon her face. After Mr. Losburn had fixed a day for his departure to Chertsey, these symptoms increased, and it became evident that something was in progress which affected the peace of the young lady, and of somebody else besides. At length one morning, when Rose was alone in the breakfast parlour, Harry Maylie entered, and, with some hesitation, begged permission to speak with her for a few moments. A very few will suffice, Rose," said the young man, drawing his chair towards her. "What I shall have to say has already presented itself to your mind. The most cherished hopes of my heart are not unknown to you, though from my lips you have not heard them stated." Rose had been very pale from the moment of his entrance, but that might have been the effect of her recent illness. She merely bowed, and bending over some plants that stood near her, waited in silence for him to proceed. I ought to have left here before," said Harry. "You should indeed," replied Rose. "Forgive me for saying so, but I wish you had." "I was brought here by the most dreadful and agonizing of all apprehensions," said the young man, "the fear of losing the one dear being on whom my every wish and hope are fixed. You had been dying, trembling between earth and heaven. We know that when the young, the beautiful, the good are visited with sickness, their pure spirits insensibly turn towards their bright home of lasting rest. We know, heaven help us, that the best and fairest of our kind too often fade in blooming." There were tears in the eyes of the gentle girl as these words were spoken, and when one fell upon the flower over which she bent, and glistened brightly in its cup, making it more beautiful, it seemed as though the outpouring of her fresh young heart claimed kindred naturally with the loveliest things in nature. "A creature," continued the young man passionately, "a creature as fair and innocent of guile as one of God's own angels, fluttered between life and death. Oh, who could hope, when the distant world to which she was akin half opened to her view, that she would return to the sorrow and calamity of this? Rose, Rose, to know that you were passing away like some soft shadow, which a light from above casts upon the earth, to have no hope that you would be spared to those who linger here, hardly to know a reason why you should be, to feel that you belong to that bright sphere whither so many of the fairest and the best have winged their early flight, and yet to pray, amid all these consolations, that you might be restored to those who loved you. These were distractions almost too great to bear. They were mine by day and by night, and with them came such a rushing torrent of fears and apprehensions, and selfish regrets, lest you should die, and never know how devotedly I love you, as almost bore down sense and reason in its course. You recovered, day by day, and almost hour by hour, some drop of health came back, and mingling with the spent and feeble stream of life which circulated languidly about you, swelled it again to a high and rushing tide. I have watched you change almost from death to life, with eyes that turned blind with their eagerness and deep affection. Do not tell me that you wish I had lost this, for it has softened my heart to all mankind." "I did not mean that," said Rose, weeping. "I only wish you had left here, that you might have turned to high and noble pursuits again, to pursuits well worthy of you." "There is no pursuit more worthy of me, more worthy of the highest nature that exists, than the struggle to win such a heart as yours," said the young man, taking her hand. "Rose, my own dear Rose, for years I have loved you, hoping to win my way to fame, and then come proudly home and tell you it had been pursued only for you to share, thinking in my daydreams how I would remind you in that happy moment of the many silent tokens I had given of a boy's attachment, and claim your hand, as in redemption of some old mute contract that had been sealed between us. That time has not arrived, but here, with not fame won and no young vision realized, I offer you the heart so long your own, and stake my all upon the words with which you greet the offer." "Your behaviour has ever been kind and noble," said Rose, mastering the emotions by which she was agitated. "As you believe that I am not insensible or ungrateful, so hear my answer. It is that I may endeavour to deserve you. It is, dear Rose." "It is," replied Rose, "that you must endeavour to forget me, not as your old, dearly attached companion, for that would wound me deeply, but as the object of your love. Look into the world. Think how many hearts you would be proud to gain are there. Confide some other passion to me if you will. I will be the truest, warmest, and most faithful friend you have." There was a pause, during which Rose, who had covered her face with one hand, gave free vent to her tears. Harry still retained the other. "And your reasons, Rose," he said at length in a low voice, "your reasons for this decision?" "You have a right to know them," rejoined Rose. "You can say nothing to alter my resolution. It is a duty that I must perform. I owe it alike to others and to myself." "To yourself?" "Yes, Harry, I owe it to myself that I, a friendless, portionless girl, with a blight upon my name, should not give your friends reason to suspect that I sordidly yielded to your first passion, and fastened myself, a clog, on all your hopes and projects. I owe it to you and yours to prevent you from opposing in the warmth of your generous nature this obstacle to your progress in the world." "If your inclinations chime in with your sense of duty—" Harry began. "They do not," replied Rose, colouring deeply. "Then you return my love?" said Harry. "Say but that, dear Rose, say but that, and soften the bitterness of this hard disappointment." "If I could have done so without doing heavy wrong to him I loved," rejoined Rose, "I could have—" "Have received this declaration very differently," said Harry. "Do not conceal that from me, at least, Rose." "I could," said Rose. "Stay," she added, disengaging her hand. "Why should we prolong this painful interview? Most painful to me, and yet productive of lasting happiness notwithstanding. For it will be happiness to know that I once held the high place in your regard which I now occupy, and every triumph you achieve in life will animate me with new fortitude and firmness. Farewell, Harry. As we have met to-day, we meet no more, but in other relations than those in which this conversation hath placed us, we may be long and happily entwined, and may every blessing that the prayers of a true and earnest heart can call down from the source of all truth and sincerity cheer and prosper you." "Another word, Rose," said Harry. "Your reason in your own words, from your own lips. Let me hear it." "The prospect before you," answered Rose firmly, "is a brilliant one. All the honours to which great talents and powerful connections can help men in public life are in store for you. But those connections are proud, and I will neither mingle with such as may hold in scorn the mother who gave me life, nor bring disgrace or failure on the son of her who has so well supplied that mother's place. In a word," said the young lady, turning away, as her temporary firmness forsook her, "there is a stain upon my name which the world visits on innocent heads. I shall carry it into no blood but my own, and the reproach shall rest alone on me." "One more word, Rose, dearest Rose, one more," cried Harry, throwing himself before her. "If I had been less fortunate, the world would call it, if some obscure and peaceful life had been my destiny, if I had been poor, sick, and helpless, would you have turned from me then? Or has my probable advancement to riches and honour given this scruple birth?" "Do not press me to reply," answered Rose. "The question does not arise, and never will. It is unfair, almost unkind, to urge it." "If your answer be what I almost dare to hope it is," retorted Harry, "it will shed a gleam of happiness upon my lonely way, and light the path before me. It is not an idle thing to do so much by the utterance of a few brief words, for one who loves you beyond all else. O Rose, in the name of my ardent and enduring attachment, in the name of all I have suffered for you, and all you doom me to undergo, answer me this one question." "Then, if your lot had been differently cast," rejoined Rose, "if you had been even a little, but not so far, above me, if I could have been a help and comfort to you in any humble scene of peace and retirement, and not a blot and drawback in ambitious and distinguished crowds, I should have been spared this trial. I have every reason to be happy, very happy now. But then, Harry, I own I should have been happier." Busy recollections of old hopes, cherished as a girl long ago, crowded into the mind of Rose while making this avowal. But they brought tears with them, as old hopes will when they come back withered, and they relieved her. "I cannot help this weakness, and it makes my purpose stronger," said Rose, extending her hand. "I must leave you now, indeed." "I ask one promise," said Harry. "Once, and only once more, say within a year, but it may be much sooner, I may speak to you again on this subject for the last time." "Not to press me to alter my right determination," replied Rose, with a melancholy smile. "It will be useless." "No," said Harry. "To hear you repeat it, if you will, finally repeat it. I will lay at your feet whatever of station or fortune I may possess, and if you still adhere to your present resolution, will not seek by word or act to change it." "Then let it be so," rejoined Rose. "It is but one pang the more, and by that time I may be enabled to bear it better." She extended her hand again, but the young man caught her to his bosom, and imprinting one kiss on her beautiful forehead, hurried from the room. Chapter 35. 36 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Is a very short one, and may appear of no great importance in its place, but it should be read notwithstanding as a sequel to the last and a key to the one that will follow when its time arrives. "And so you are resolved to be my travelling companion this morning, eh?" said the doctor, as Harry Maylie joined him and Oliver at the breakfast table. "Why, you are not in the same mind or intention 2 half-hours together." "You will tell me a different tale one of these days," said Harry, colouring without any perceptible reason. "I hope I may have good cause to do so," replied Mr. Losburn, "though I confess I don't think I shall. But yesterday morning you had made up your mind in a great hurry to stay here, and to accompany your mother like a dutiful son to the seaside. Before noon you announced that you were going to do me the honour of accompanying me as far as I go on your road to London, and at night you urged me with great mystery to start before the ladies are stirring. The consequence of which is that young Oliver here is pinned down to his breakfast when he ought to be ranging the meadows after botanical phenomena of all kinds. Too bad, isn't it, Oliver?" "I should have been very sorry not to have been at home when you and Mr. Maylie went away, sir," rejoined Oliver. "That's a fine fellow," said the doctor. "You shall come and see me when you return. But to speak seriously, Harry, has any communication from the great Nobbs produced this sudden anxiety on your part to be gone?" "The great Nobbs," replied Harry, "under which designation I presume you include my most stately uncle, have not communicated with me at all since they have been here. Nor at this time of year is it likely that anything would occur to render necessary my immediate attendance among them." "Well," said the doctor, "you are a queer fellow. But of course they will get you into Parliament at the election before Christmas, and these sudden shiftings and changes are no bad preparation for political life. There's something in that. Good training is always desirable, whether the race be for place, cup, or sweepstakes." Harry Maylie looked as if he could have followed up this short dialogue by one or two remarks that would have staggered the doctor not a little, but he contented himself with saying, "We shall see," and pursued the subject no further. The post-chaise drove up to the door shortly afterwards, and Giles coming in for the luggage, the good doctor bustled out to see it packed. "Oliver," said Harry Maylie in a low voice, "let me speak a word with you." Oliver walked into the window recess to which Mr. Maylie beckoned him, much surprised at the mixture of sadness and boisterous spirits which his whole behaviour displayed. "You can write well now?" said Harry, laying his hand upon his arm. "I hope so, sir," replied Oliver. "I shall not be at home again, perhaps, for some time. I wish you would write to me, say once a fortnight, every alternate Monday, to the General Post Office in London. Will you?"